The night it happened, I wasn't even home. At least that's what the HOA officers thought. They assumed my driveway was empty because I was out of town. They assumed my blinds were drawn because I had something to hide. What they didn't know was that every corner of my home, every single door, window, hallway was wired to a system far beyond their imagination. Not your typical cameras, not your typical alarms. I had a direct security feed linked straight to Homeland, and that changed everything. It started like any ordinary evening. The neighborhood was unusually quiet, almost too quiet. People had whispered before that the HOA in our community wasn't just strict, they were obsessive. Finding neighbors for leaving trash bins out 10 minutes late, harassing families for holiday decorations, even measuring grass with rulers. Petty, suffocating control, that's what they thrived on. But I never thought they'd go as far as breaking into someone's house, especially mine. But that's exactly what they did. I was sitting in a hotel room hundreds of miles away when my phone buzzed. At first, I ignored it. Another notification, I thought. But then the alert turned red on the screen. Unauthorized entry detected. Homeland feed activated. My heart stopped. My hands shook as I tapped the screen, and there it was, live. Footage of 3 men in dark jackets pushing their way through my side door. Their jackets carried one word printed across the back in bold white letters, HOA. Think about that for a second. The very people who were supposed to protect the neighborhood's standards. The people who claimed they cared about safety were now trespassing into my home like criminals. And the worst part, they were smiling. The camera in my kitchen caught one of them laughing as he shoved a chair out of his way. Another flipped on a flashlight, scanning the walls as if hunting for secrets. They weren't just looking around, they were searching for something specific. And I couldn't help but ask myself, what did they think they'd find? What did they believe I was hiding? The screen on my phone split into 4. Feeds: hallway, kitchen, living room, upstairs landing. Their footsteps echoed through my speakers, each creak of the floorboards making my chest tighten. My pulse raced. My throat went dry. And for a moment, I wondered if I hadn't installed this system, would I ever have known? I wanted to call the police immediately, but then I remembered something. I didn't have to, because my system wasn't just any alarm. It was already connected to a Homeland Security monitoring hub. The second they stepped foot into my house, the feed didn't just go to me, it went to them. And I knew, as I watched those men wander deeper into my home, that I wasn't the only one watching anymore. But here's where it gets complicated. Instead of an immediate siren or flashing lights, my system stayed silent. No alarms, no warnings. To them, it was like walking into an empty house. They had no clue they were being watched by me, and more importantly, by eyes far more powerful than mine. Homeland had a strategy. Observe first, act later, collect proof. Let them dig their own graves. And they did. The man in front, the tallest of the 3, pulled a folder out of his jacket pocket. He set it down on my kitchen counter and flipped it open. From the grainy angle of the overhead camera, I could just make out the pages, lists, addresses, names, my neighbors' names, and next to each scribbled notes. Some were crossed out. Some had red circles. And then there was mine, highlighted in yellow, underlined twice. Why? What had I done to deserve that kind of target on my back? I thought back to all the confrontations I'd had with the HOA. The time I refused to cut down the oak tree in my front yard. The time I fought back when they tried to fine me for flying the flag. The countless meetings where I stood up and said no when everyone else bowed their heads and obeyed. Maybe this was their revenge. Maybe they wanted to break me, scare me into silence. But the moment I realized my name wasn't the only one on that list, the story changed. This wasn't about me. This was about everyone. They had dossiers on the entire neighborhood, as if they weren't officers of an association, but enforcers of something darker. My phone buzzed again, louder this time. A message flashed across the screen. Stay calm. Do not engage. The units are en route. Homeland was already moving, but watching them in real time, it made my blood boil. One of the men opened my refrigerator, laughing as he pulled out a bottle of water and took a long drink. Another started rifling through my mail on the counter, tearing open envelopes. They weren't just intruders. They were predators, feeding off the sense of control they thought they had. And that's when something inside me snapped. Because I wasn't just a passive observer. I wasn't just a victim waiting for help to arrive. This was my home, my safe place, memories, my family's, photos, my belongings. And they had no right to it. I tapped another button on my phone. A hidden speaker in the living room came to life, and with a steady, cold voice, I spoke. "I can see you." The reaction was instant. All three men froze. One dropped the flashlight, its beam spinning wildly across the floor. Their heads jerked toward the sound, eyes wide, skin pale. "I know what you're doing," I continued, my voice steady but my hands trembling. "And so does Homeland Security." Panic spread across their faces like wildfire. The tallest one shouted something I couldn't make out, and they scrambled toward the door. But before they could reach it, red and blue lights flashed outside. My windows. Sirens pierced the silence. They were surrounded. Now, before I go any further, I need you to really think about this. What would you do if the very people meant to keep order in your neighborhood were the ones violating it? How would you feel watching them trample through your home, tearing apart your trust only to realize their corruption went far deeper than you imagined? Tell me in the comments, because I want to know, was I right to let Homeland handle it, or should I have taken matters into my own hands? Because in that moment, as the sirens grew louder and the officers scrambled like rats trapped in a cage, I couldn't help but feel a mix of satisfaction and dread. Satisfaction because they were caught. Dread because I realized this wasn't the end. This was only the beginning. And if you think it stops here, if you think the HOA will just walk away quietly after this, you're wrong. Dead wrong, so don't go anywhere. Stay with me, because what happens next will make you question everything you thought you knew about power, about control, and about what really goes on behind those closed HOA doors. And by the way, if you're watching this right now, don't just scroll on. I need you to like this video, share it, and tell me your opinion below. Because the truth is, I'm not just fighting this for me. I'm fighting it for every single homeowner who's ever been bullied, harassed, or silenced by people who thought they were untouchable. Watch until the end, because you won't believe how deep this goes. The flashing lights painted my walls red and blue, shadows leaping across family photos like ghosts from another world. I watched through the feed as the HOA officer stumbled toward the door, but it was too late. The first officer outside shouted for them to freeze. One of the men, the one who had been laughing in my kitchen only minutes before, bolted toward the backyard. His panic was so raw, it almost felt satisfying to watch until I remembered something crucial. The backyard had no exit. My fence was 10 feet high, reinforced. He was running into a dead end. Homeland agents swarmed, their movements sharp, disciplined. Nothing like the chaos inside. The feed caught one of them tackling the fleeing man to the ground, pinning him with brutal efficiency. The other two froze in the doorway, hands raised, faces pale. The same smug smiles that mocked my home moments earlier were gone, replaced with the hollow terror of men who realized they weren't in control anymore. But here's the thing. Watching them being hauled out of my house should have been enough. It should have given me closure. Yet as I stared at the screens, I felt an unease that went deeper than relief. Because if they had a folder with neighbors' names, if they were this bold, this reckless, what else had they been hiding? I thought I was done with them. I thought the night was over. I was wrong. The next morning, I woke up to dozens of messages. My phone was a battlefield of notifications, missed calls, texts, emails. Neighbors asking if I was okay, demanding to know what had happened, telling me squad cars had blocked off the street. People were scared, but more than that, they were confused. And when people don't have answers, rumors fill the gaps. One message stood out. It was from a woman down the street, quiet, reserved, never one to gossip. Her text was short. "I think they've been in my house too." My blood ran cold. I called her immediately, and her voice trembled as she explained. Strange noises at night. Items out of place. A window she swore she'd locked suddenly wide open. She had dismissed it all as paranoia. But now, she wasn't so sure, and she wasn't the only one. By noon, at least 5 other neighbors admitted the same thing. Small details that never made sense, mail tools that vanished from garages, doors left unlocked. They hadn't thought much of it before, but now it was clear. The HOA had been creeping into people's lives far longer than anyone realized. And the question that gnawed at me was, why? That night, I sat at my kitchen table. Yes, the same one they'd invaded on. Spread out the photos Homeland had given me. Evidence from the raid. Documents, maps, lists. And one page in particular nearly made me fall out of my chair. It wasn't just a list of names. It was a schedule, a rotation, times and dates when certain homes would be visited. Each home marked with cryptic notes words like check, pressure, and remove. Pressure, remove? What did that even mean?
Ow!
One name on the list had 3 red marks beside it. My neighbor, James. An older veteran, quiet, always kept to himself. I hadn't seen him in weeks. Suddenly, I realized maybe it wasn't by choice. This is the moment I have to stop and rehook you, because if you're listening, if you've made it this far, you need to ask yourself, what would you do if you found out your community leaders weren't just corrupt? They were orchestrating something bigger, something sinister. Would you still stay silent? Or would you demand answers? Tell me in the comments, because this isn't just a story, it's a warning. The more I dug, the worse it got. Homeland's investigation revealed that some of these so-called officers weren't just neighborhood volunteers. They had connections, old ties to private security firms, even whispers of foreign contracts. People with training, not just clipboards and rulebooks. And if that's true, then this wasn't about homeowners associations anymore. This was about control, intimidation, and power. But here's where the story twists again. Because while Homeland had 3 of them in custody, there were more. The documents mentioned at least 7 officers, which meant 4 were still out there, watching, waiting. And then it happened. The second break-in, only this time, weren't coming for me. They went after a family 2 streets over, a young couple with a newborn baby. Homeland caught it. On surveillance, but the difference was chilling. They didn't sneak in quietly. They smashed the back window. They tore through the house, like they wanted to be seen, like they wanted to send a message. The couple was terrified. The baby screamed as glass shattered, but before agents could intervene, the intruders slipped away, vanishing into the night. Like shadows, they hadn't taken anything. They hadn't left evidence. They just left fear. And that's when I realized this wasn't random. This was psychological warfare. They wanted the neighborhood on edge. They wanted everyone afraid. Because fear makes people easier to control. And that's the true weapon of corrupt power. It doesn't just steal from you. It breaks you from the inside out. That night, as I sat in silence, my phone buzzed again. A restricted number. Against my better judgment, I answered, "Stop talking." A distorted voice said, "Stop sharing. Stop fighting. You'll regret it." Then the line went dead. I can't even describe the chill that ran through me. It wasn't just a threat. It was a declaration. They weren't done. They weren't afraid. And maybe I should have listened. Maybe I should have gone quiet. But that's not who I am. And if you've been with me this far, I know it's not who you are either. We don't back down when we're bullied. We don't cave to threats. We fight back. So let me ask you, what would you have done? Would you have turned off the cameras, kept your head down, and prayed it went away? Or would you have done what I did, Lyndon, dug deeper, and prepared to expose every dark secret hiding behind those HOA doors? Because the truth is, what came next would rip the mask off everything I thought I knew about my neighborhood, my safety, and even my own past. And if you think it can't get worse, trust, MIT does. That's why you need to keep watching. Don't just stop here. Hit that like button. Share this with someone who's ever felt powerless in their own home. And tell me your opinion in the comments, because I promise you this is not just a story. It's a fight that belongs to all of us. The night after that phone call, I barely slept. Every sound outside my window felt like footsteps. Every flicker of light across my blinds made my heart pound harder. But it wasn't just fear that kept me awake, it was anger. Pure burning. Anger. Because they thought they could scare me into silence. They thought one call, one veiled threat, would make me back down. But they didn't know me.
Ow.
They didn't understand that every threat only fueled me more. And as I sat there, in the dark, staring at the faint glow of my security monitors, I made a decision. I wasn't going to wait for them to strike again.
Ow.
I was going to strike first. Homeland had already told me to stay back, to let them handle it, to trust their process. But how do you stay back when your neighbors are being terrorized? How do you sit idle when children are sleeping in fear because the very people meant to enforce order are smashing windows in the night? Can't. Not if you have a conscience. Not if you have any spine at all. So I started digging. Every HOA meeting is recorded. Every officer's name is on file. I went through the archives, poring over hours of footage, scanning every face, every whispered conversation that didn't seem right. And then I noticed something odd. During one meeting months ago, the same tall man who had led the break-in into my home stood up and made a proposal. He wanted access to safety inspections inside homes, claims that it was for fire alarms, wiring checks, things like that. At the time, the room laughed it off. But what if it wasn't a joke? What if that was their way of normalizing the idea of stepping into people's houses? I paused the footage and stared at his face. He wasn't laughing. He wasn't even smiling. He was testing the waters. And suddenly, all the pieces began to connect. The folder with neighbors' names, the schedules, the surveillance-like notes. This wasn't just about harassment or fines. This was about building a system of control, one step at a time. But then came the discovery that chilled me the most. One of the officers who had escaped the Homeland raid showed up in another piece of footage standing beside a man I recognized instantly. A developer. Someone with ties to buying up foreclosed homes in our county. And that's when it hit me like a punch to the gut. They weren't breaking into homes just to scare people. They were creating pressure, retargeting families, terrifying them until they broke down, until they either left or sold their houses cheap. And guess who was waiting on the other side to snatch those homes up? It wasn't about the HOA. It wasn't about neighborhood standards. It was a pipeline. Fear to foreclosure. Foreclosure to profit. Tell me honestly, if that was your house, your neighborhood, your family, how far would you go to stop it? Would you expose it, even if it meant putting a target on your own back? Comment below, because I want to know if you would have had the courage to take the next step I did. Because I couldn't let it slide. I couldn't just sit back anymore. I decided to confront them, but it couldn't be reckless. I needed proof. Undeniable proof that couldn't be buried, denied, or twisted. So I set a trap. Using the same security system they thought they'd already beaten, I staged my own absence. I left my car parked a block away, left my blinds drawn, lights off. Everything looked perfect for another inspection. But this time, the house wasn't empty. I was inside, silent, watching, waiting, and sure enough, just after midnight, I heard the faint scrape of metal against my back door lock. My breath caught in my throat as the door creaked open. Two shadows slipped inside, moving low, careful. They thought they were hunters. They didn't realize they'd just walked into a cage. I stayed hidden, phone in hand, recording everything. The taller one whispered to the other, "Quick, grab the file cabinet." My heart pounded so hard I thought they'd hear it. My file cabinet. The one in my office. The one with documents they shouldn't even know existed. And that's when I realized they weren't just after general fear. They were after me, my files, my evidence. They wanted to erase the trail before it exposed them all. But they didn't know one thing. I had already backed everything up. Homeland already had copies. So even if they burned my house to the ground, it wouldn't matter. Their secret was already unraveling. I stepped out of the shadows and let my voice cut through the silence. Looking for something? The flashlight beam jerked toward me, catching just enough of my face for them to recognize me. Oh, the shock in their eyes was priceless, like they'd seen a ghost. For a split second, no one moved. Then one of them lunged. But I was ready. Alarm blared to life, deafening, shaking the walls. Homeland agents burst through the front door in seconds. They'd been stationed outside, waiting for the signal. The intruders didn't stand a chance. They were dragged down, pinned, cuffed, and I stood there, chest heaving, watching it all unfold. And for the first time in weeks, I felt something I hadn't dared to feel before: safety. But it was short-lived, because as the agents escorted them out, one of the men twisted his head toward me, his lip curling into a smile that made my stomach churn. "This isn't over," he hissed, and deep down, I knew he was right. Because this wasn't just about two men. It wasn't just about the officers who had broken into my home, or even the HOA board members sitting in that meeting room. This was bigger. It stretched beyond my neighborhood, beyond my town. It was a system, a machine, and cutting off one piece of it wouldn't stop the rest. So if you're listening to me right now, I need you to do something. Don't just watch. Don't just nod along and shake your head. Drop your opinion below. Tell me if you've ever faced something like this, because I know I'm not alone. I know there are people all over this country dealing with HOAs that abuse their power. People who feel trapped in their own homes. And if you felt that, you understand the fight isn't just mine, it's ours. And that's why you need to watch till the end, because what comes next will prove just how deep this corruption really goes. The night they dragged those officers out of my house should have been the end. The lights, the handcuffs, the sound of boots pounding against the floor, it felt like closure, like maybe I could finally breathe again. But when I looked into their eyes, when I saw the twisted smirk of a man who should have been broken, but instead looked smug, I knew deep down this fight wasn't finished, and I was right. The very next day, the neighborhood was buzzing. People were gathered in driveways, voices hushed but sharp, like bees circling a hive that had just been struck. Some were relieved finally, justice. Others were furious, not at the officers, but at me. They muttered words like troublemaker, instigator. And that's when it hit me. The HOA wasn't just an organization. For some, it was a religion, blind loyalty, obedience no matter what. That evening, as the sun dipped low, I got a knock on my door. Not from agents, not from neighbors. From the HOA president herself. She stood there on my porch with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. A smile painted on like a mask. "We need to talk," she said softly. Every part of me wanted to slam the door shut, but curiosity, maybe even stubbornness, kept me from moving. I stepped aside, and she walked in like she owned the place. Her heels clicked across my floor, echoing with an arrogance that made my skin crawl. "You've made quite the mess," she began, her voice calm, almost amused. "Homeland cameras? Really? You know how dangerous it is to stir things you don't understand?" I clenched my fists. Dangerous is breaking into people's homes. Dangerous is terrorizing families. Don't talk to me about danger. Her smile widened, sharp as glass. "You think this is about homes? About families?" "No. This is about order, control. Without us, this neighborhood would collapse into chaos. People don't know what's best for themselves. We do, and sometimes sacrifices must be made. Sacrifices." The word sank into me like ice water. I realized then that the officers were just pawns. The president, the calm, collected woman, sitting in my living room, was the real architect. She wasn't afraid of Homeland. She wasn't afraid of exposure, because in her mind, she was untouchable. But she underestimated one thing. I wasn't afraid of her anymore as she leaned back. In the chair, her eyes darted to the corner of the room where one of my hidden cameras blinked faintly. She froze, realizing too late that everything she'd just said was recorded. Her mask cracked. For the first time, I saw fear. I leaned forward, my voice steady. "It's over. Every word you just said is on Homeland servers. They're probably listening right now." Her face twisted, the composure shattering, replaced by raw fury. She stood up fast, knocking the chair backward. "You don't know what you've done," she spat, pointing a shaking finger at me. "You think you've won, but you've only made enemies you can't even see." And then she stormed out, slamming the door so hard the frame rattled. should have been the end. But instead, it was the spark that lit the final fire. Within hours, Homeland agents arrived not just to my house, but across the neighborhood. Warrants, seizures, boxes of files carried out of the HOA office under floodlights. Neighbors gathered, watching silently as the facade crumbled. The whispers weren't whispers anymore. They were questions, demands. People who had been silent for years were finally asking, what have they been doing to us? How far has this gone? And yet, even in that moment of victory, I couldn't shake the weight pressing on my chest. Because I knew corruption doesn't die in a single night. It hides, it shifts, it waits for its next chance. The following week was a blur. News crews, interviews, government vehicles parked in cul-de-sacs. The HOA officers who had been arrested were facing federal charges. The president disappeared, vanished before she could be taken in. Others whispered darker things, that she had help, that people higher up wanted her protected. And that's when I realized something terrifying. This wasn't just my HOA. It wasn't just my neighborhood. This was bigger, a network, system, of control reaching further than any of us wanted to believe. So if you're watching this, I want you to understand something. This story, it isn't just entertainment. It's a warning. What happened here could happen anywhere. If you think your HOA, your neighborhood association, your so-called community leaders don't have the power to overstep, to manipulate, to destroy, you might be wrong. Dead wrong. That's why I need you. Yes, you, watching this right now. Don't just let this video end and scroll away. I want you to drop your opinion in the comments. Tell me if this had happened to you. Would you have fought back, or would you have stayed quiet? And if you've ever faced an HOA that abused its power, share your story. Because when we speak, we take back the power they try so hard to steal. Like this video if you believe no one should feel unsafe in their own home. Share it with someone who needs to know they're not alone. And stay until the very last second. Because I promise you this fight isn't just mine. It's all of ours. When I look back now at the empty folders, the shattered windows, the flashing lights that turned my quiet street into a battlefield, I realize something. They didn't just break into my house. They broke into the very idea of safety. They showed me how fragile it all is. But they also showed me something else, how strong we can be when we refuse to bend. Because in the end, the real power doesn't come from fear or rules or threats behind closed doors. It comes from people who are willing to stand, to speak, to fight when no one else will. And that's why I'll never forget the night the HOA officers broke into my house, not knowing I had a security system linked to Homeland. Because in their arrogance, they revealed the truth. And in my fear, I found my strength. So here's my final question for you. What would you have done if it were your home? Would you have fought? Would you have resisted? Or would you have stayed silent? Tell me below. Because your answer might be the spark someone else needs to finally take their stand.